Om Jnanatimirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaur Bhaktivinoda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So Hare Krishna, dear devotees, those of you who are watching, listening. Tonight and next Wednesday and maybe the following Wednesday after that as well, so it might go for, definitely will go for 2 parts, but it might go, thank you, for 3 parts as well. We're going to be discussing from a Bengali poem which was written by Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur Maharaj. So we request the blessings of the Vaisnavas, we request the blessings of Srila Prabhupada and his spiritual master, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, to be able to discuss this poem. It's called Vaishnava Ke, and it's translated as, what kind of devotee are you? So this is the particular book that I'm going to use. So it's actually, the poem is written by Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and the commentary is given by His Holiness Jayapataka Swami. And Maharaj also includes verse translations and extensive quotations by Srila Prabhupada, so from his books as well. And I'll just read the blurb at the back. It says, this legendary Bengali poem written by His Divine Grace, Srimad Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, contains revelations and practical guidance to aid the aspiring devotee in dealing with the types of nonsense deviations which may continue to be proposed by the mind to distract a devotee until he reaches the level of pure devotional service. So I have to say right from the get-go, it's in the perfect style of Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur. He's known as the Simha Guru. And from what we know about Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he always had a sense of urgency to preach Krishna consciousness, and in an uncompromising way. And we see that when Srila Prabhupada himself went and first met Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and he told Srila Prabhupada, our Srila Prabhupada, that there was no time to wait until India became liberated from the British rule. Krishna consciousness had to be spread right then and there. And some time back, a devotee was showing me a class which was being given by Amarendra Prabhu, and he was quoting this verse from the 11th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. Labdva sudhurlabam idam bahu sambhavante manusyamartadam anityam apiha dhira turnam yatetana patedan umrityu yavan nishreya saya vishaya khalu sarvatah syat. So this is coming from Srimad Bhagavatam, 11th canto, chapter 9, verse 29. It's from the Avadut Brahman section, and it's talking about material existence. And Amarendra Prabhu, from what I remember, what I overheard him saying, he said that Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur used to actually get rather emotional when he used to quote this verse. And I'll just read the translation to it, just so that we can understand the mood of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur. The translation for this verse is, after many, many births and deaths, one achieves the rare human form of life, which, although temporary, affords one the opportunity to attain the highest perfection. Thus, a sober human being should quickly endeavor for the ultimate perfection of life, as long as his body, which is always subject to death, has not fallen down and died. After all, sense gratification is available even in the abominable species, whereas Krishna consciousness is possible only for the human being. So this is Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur's mood of urgency to preach Krishna consciousness. And if you read this Bengali poem, the translations are, it's quite direct actually, and parts of it are very confronting. But sometimes this is necessary for us. It really makes, it sort of just pushes us against the wall and sort of makes us question and introspect as to, are we practicing bhakti, Krishna consciousness for the right reasons? What are actually our motivations for practicing? But in the introduction of the book, His Holiness Jayapataka Maharaj actually makes it a point to talk about the real purpose why Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is a little heavy in this particular poem. He says, as the greatest religious reformer of his time, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur could see how in the name of solitary worship devotees were being lost to Maya. Although sometimes in the tone, although sometimes the tone of what kind of devotee are you may be critical, the reader should understand that it is actually out of compassion and mercy that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur wrote, and not out of the materialistic fault-finding propensity. So this heaviness that is being shown in this particular poem by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is purely just to wake us up and confront us so that we can question ourselves and that we can improve the quality of our service to Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga and Sri Krishna. And His Holiness Jayapataka Maharaj actually mentions that early on when he came across this poem, he started reciting some of the verses from this poem, Vaisnava K, in some of the evening classes that he used to give, and devotees were really amazed by the knowledge which was coming from this poem. And they actually, many of Maharaj's godbrothers and godsisters and other senior devotees actually requested Jayapataka Maharaj to actually compile a separate book for the benefit of the devotees. So after repeated requests, he finally managed to compile this book actually. So without further ado, we'll start. So there's actually 19 verses in total. So I'm planning to cover maybe 6 or 7 verses, hopefully. I'll try. There's a lot to talk about. We'll try to get to the end of verse 6 today. Okay, so we'll start with verse 1. I'll read the Bengali, and forgive my pronunciation. It's not so good. Dushta mana, tumi kesera Vaishnav, pratishtara tare, nirjaner ghare, Tava Harinam Kevala Kaitava. Translation is, my dear mind, what kind of a Vaishnav are you? Simply for false prestige and a material reputation, you sit in a solitary place and pretend to chant the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, but this is all cheating. Now the way that this book, or not the book, but the poem has been set out by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is he's treating his mind as another person. Generally, we treat our minds as being ourselves. We identify ourselves with our mind. If our mind is desiring something, we say, I want to do this, I want to do that. But Srimad Bhagavatam explains that niragnir analoyata, janayati ashu yakosham niragnir analoyata, that just as the fire of digestion in our stomach, it dissolves the food, it digests the food. So similarly, practicing bhakti yoga, it dissolves our subtle body. Because we are not our gross physical body, we're not our subtle body as well. So if you're going through trouble, if we're going through trouble with our mind, with our material desires, past habits, and some scars and all that sort of stuff, then we can try this technique that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is showing here, exemplifying here. He's treating his mind as a secondary person. So if you're getting some bad thoughts or desires in your mind, then you can actually talk to your mind and you can tell your mind, my dear mind, you should not be thinking like this. We should instead, both of us, we should think about Krishna. We should worship Krishna. Please become my friend. Don't torment me in this way. It is because you've been doing this, we've been taking repeated birth and death, life after life. So what this does is it actually spiritualizes our intelligence. It makes us, like if you look at that example of the chariot of the body, right? This sort of technique, it strengthens the chariot driver so that it can drive the chariot of the body in the proper direction. So this is a very useful technique that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is presenting to us in this bhajan. And if you look at different types of yoga systems, like Gyan Yoga or Ashtanga Yoga, Dhyan Yoga, they sort of work on the individual practicing by themselves in solitary. So the theme throughout, or a good part of this Vaishnava Ke bhajan, is Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's really hammering on the point that progress in bhakti comes in the association of devotees. It doesn't happen by ourselves. Like we see when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he went to Varanasi. He was coming back, I think from Vrindavan, then he stopped at Varanasi. And then Prakashananda Saraswati Thakur, the Mayavadi sannyasi, they're like Gyanis, they study Vedanta. He started to criticize Chaitanya Mahaprabhu for congregating with other Vaishnavas and devotees and sentimentally chanting the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. And he instead said that the duty of a sannyasi is to actually just sit down peacefully, quietly, alone, and just study the Vedanta. But in Bhakti Yoga, we don't do that. Instead, we preach the message, Hari Katha, Krishna Katha, to the people. We preach the message to the devotees as well. Everything is done with other devotees. Or, for example, in Ashtanga Yoga, we see in the 6th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is actually telling Arjuna to go to to some forest and sit on a deer skin, right? And with kusha grass surrounding, like the asan. It should not be too high, too low, like that. All these different criteria are given. But that's sort of not what Bhakti Yoga is about. Bhakti Yoga is all about practicing in the association of devotees. And my Guru Maharaj, Devamitra Maharaj, he actually explains that the more devotees we have surrounding us, who can give us guidance and instructions, the more we should consider ourselves to be wealthy in devotional service. Now, I know it's said that we should not have too many Shiksha Gurus, otherwise we might get confused. So I'm not talking about Shiksha Gurus, but I'm just talking about generally if we surround ourselves with devotees, like we have examples of Bharat Maharaj, of Sobari Muni, who are practicing their sadhana alone. And just because they didn't have another devotee, doesn't matter if it was a spiritual master or any, just any, even a neophyte devotee. Even a neophyte devotee can help us by telling us, you're going off track a little bit. Maybe you should consider what you're doing, reconsider what you're doing. So if we have devotees around us, then we should consider ourselves to be very fortunate in Bhakti Yoga. And a nice example can be given in this situation of a farmer. He was a farmer who was really expert at corn plantations. And his corn plantations, the corn that he used to grow was really first-class corn. And every year he would enter a contest. And he would come out as the best corn-producing farmer in the district. So one day, the media actually came to his farm to interview him, to see, what is the secret behind his corn. First-class, excellent, juicy, succulent corn. And they were amazed to find out that this farmer was actually supplying his prize-winning seeds, the corn kernels, to his neighbor, who was also a corn farmer. And his neighbor is actually entering the contest as well. And the media asked this farmer, why are you supplying your prize-winning corn to your neighbor? Don't you fear that, they'll win the contest? And he said, look, if I have to win the contest, then my neighbor also has to have first-class corn as well. Because if they have an inferior quality corn growing in their farm, then because of cross-pollination, we see the bees or wind, sometimes it carries the pollen from one plant to another plant, it germinates it, and then we have vegetables and fruits which grow. So if my neighbor has an inferior corn plantation, the wind will carry the pollen, enter my plantation, and then gradually over a period of time, my first-class quality corn will start to degrade in quality as well. So if I am to win the contest, if I am to always have high-quality corn, then I have to ensure that my neighbor also has to have high-quality corn. And this is exactly the theme that we have in Bhakti as well. Krishna is not pleased with us just advancing in devotional service ourselves. We see the examples of the prachetas.
Varam vinidram badramo yuyam no nipa nandana sohardena pritag dharmas tushtoham sohardenava. When Vishnu actually comes and congratulates the Prachetas, he says, I'm very pleased by your austerities in devotional service. Why? Because you 10 brothers are working together in harmony to please me and to satisfy me. So this is bhakti. And the example might be given of our acharyas, because sometimes a doubt might be raised, like especially our recent acharyas, some of them happen to be practicing Krishna consciousness by themselves. Like take, for example, Gaurkishore Das Babaji or Jagannath Das Babaji. They were engaged in sitting in solitary. But here we see Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is saying we shouldn't do that. First of all, we have to understand that all of our acharyas are great Mahabhagavatas. They're fully self-controlled Uttamadhikaris. But here's the thing. Srila Prabhupada himself also spent 9 years in Vrindavan. And he explains he used to go every day to Jiva Goswami's Samadhi, used to visit Rupa Goswami's Samadhi, and his Bhajan Kutir, he used to visit the Radha Damodar temple. But the purpose why he did that was to eventually leave Vrindavan, to go outside of Vrindavan and preach to others about Krishna consciousness and about the glories of the holy Dham, like Mayapur and Vrindavan. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is also known to have chanted 1 billion names of Krishna, on his japa beads, a feat which took him about 10 years or so. But again, just like our Srila Prabhupada, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, whatever empowerment he got with that, he didn't keep doing that for the rest of his life. He used the potency that he got from that to start the Gaudiya Math, which is the most prolific and widespread Vaisnava institution within India at that point in time, right? And then if we look at Gaurkishore Das Babaji, even though he was chanting, he would very regularly go to the house of Bhaktivinoda Thakur and listen to the Bhagavatam Katha. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur himself was also a great preacher of Srimad Bhagavatam. He wrote books and he sent these books abroad to different countries as well. We see the life and precepts of Lord Chaitanya, which appears at the beginning of Chaitanya Charitamrita and teachings of Lord Chaitanya. He happened to enter into the solitary chanting of the Hare Krishna Mahamantra towards the later end of his life. That's after, mind you, a whole life of preaching, surrounded by an entire big family of Vaishnavas. It's said that when he used to come into his house and perform the Arati ceremony in his altar, his house would transform into the spiritual world. But the reason which is understood why Bhaktivinoda Thakur did that at the end of his life is that seemingly his material body broke down through paralysis or something like that. So not being able to use his physical body, he then entered into that stage. Jagannath Das Babaji Maharaj himself, who also used to chant, he at the very end of his life, his material physical existence, actually left Vrindavan and traveled all the way to Navadvip with devotees, with other devotees, to uncover the pastime place of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Sri Mayapur Dham, Navadvip Dham. So we see that although our acharyas, they had, for at least some period of time, they did practice devotional service by themselves. The purpose was to spread Krishna consciousness to everyone else. And even when they were doing it, they were actually still associating with devotees. They never let go of that principle of associating with devotees. Right? So that's the first verse. We go on to verse 2. Jadera pratishtha shukarera vishtha janana kitaha mayara vaibhava kanaka kamini divasa yamini bhaviya ki kaja anitya se saba. So the translation is, such an ambition for a cheap reputation can be compared to the stool of a hog, because such popularity is another extension of the influence of Maya. So that translation that I just read was a translation by Srila Prabhupada from the Krishna book, Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And then the translation continues. My dear mind, while making a show of chanting the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra in a solitary place, you are simply meditating day and night about enjoying beautiful women and accumulating more wealth. What spiritual value does your solitary chanting have? On the pretext of performing solitary worship, you are actually entangled in temporary material activities. I'll just read the first paragraph by His Holiness Jaipataka Maharaj. Maharaj is saying His Divine Grace Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is showing how to purify the consciousness through direct and strong preaching to the mind. One should reveal to one's intelligence all of the mind's material pollutions and study the problem in depth to be able to wake up to reality. Then one should purify the mind by spiritual instruction and devotional service without delay. By avoiding purification of the mind, the consciousness will become more and more polluted as a result and subsequently harder to rectify. So if we don't challenge our mind, if we let it go, it'll get harder and harder to rectify as the days, the months, the years continue in devotional service. Now, chapter 6 of Bhagavad Gita tells us that one should elevate oneself with the help of the mind. The mind is one's best friend. It's also one's worst enemy as well. Uddaryad atman atmanam anatmanam avasadayat. Atmeva atmana bandhur atmeva ripur atmana. The very next verse in the 6th chapter of Bhagavad Gita explains that for one who has controlled his mind, the mind is one's best friend, and for one who has failed to do so, the mind remains his worst enemy. Now we know in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna in the 2nd chapter, he gives us a nice flow from contemplation on the sense objects to how we fall down into the material whirlpool, right? Dhyayato vishayan pumsa sangasteshu pajayate. By contemplating, one develops attachment. From attachment, lust arises, then anger, then delusion, bewilderment and memory, intelligence, spiritual intelligence is lost, and one falls into the material whirlpool. Now I just want to make, on verse 2, I just want to make a quick analysis of this thing called samskara. So this is another flow chart which we get from Vedic psychology, a Vedic analysis of how our mind works, our subtle body works. So the first step is activity. It's called kriya. When we perform any activity, okay, that can be a pious activity, it can be a neutral activity, I don't know. Let's take the example of driving a car, or it can be a sinful activity as well. But for the sake of analysis, we'll talk about a car, driving a car. When we perform that activity, it's called kriya. That creates a very high level, surface level impression on the mind. That impression on the mind, which an activity creates, is called anubhav. It might be, or what was positive about that experience, or what was negative about that experience. Like for example, if I'm a new driver, I get in the car, start driving, my first, that anubhav might be, yeah, driving a car is really nice, it's really good. But the second time, if I start driving the car, if it's a rainy day, and I almost crash the car, then my anubhav, that surface level impression on the mind, might be, oh, you know, I almost crashed the car, I shouldn't drive in the rain. Next time I shouldn't drive in the rain. So that's called anubhav. It's the immediate surface impression that comes on the mind after performing the kriya, the activity. As that anubhav, if you keep contemplating on that anubhav, that surface impression on the mind, then that impression which is on the surface of your mind, it starts to go deep into the subconscious mind. It becomes stronger, it becomes reinforced. That is called samskar. So samskar is a deep impression on the subconscious mind. Now, when you keep performing that activity, when you keep performing that kriya, and you get anubhav, and then you get samskars, when you keep getting different samskars, a whole group or a whole family of samskars leads to what is known as a vasana. And a vasana is a very deep impression of the mind, which leads us to habitually act in a certain way. So I'll give you an example of the car again. So when you're a new driver, you get into the car and you have many samskars. So you have the samskar of looking left, looking right. You have the samskar of turning on the ignition. You have this samskar of adjusting your seat, adjusting the side mirrors. You have samskar of putting the clutch onto drive. So these are different samskars. And until these samskars, these group of samskars, have not fully solidified in your subconsciousness, then each time you get into the car, you have to be still aware. Oh, okay, have I done this? Have I looked at the rear mirror? Have I looked at, when I'm changing my lane, am I looking over the shoulder? You have to keep thinking might have that checklist, because that hasn't transformed into a vasana yet. But once it does transform, once these group of samskaras do transform into a vasana, then driving a car becomes second nature. Then as soon as you get into the car, because that vasana is so strong, then you do things automatically. It becomes like a habit. Okay, that's what a vasana is. A vasana is a group of samskaras. Now, when we contemplate further on the vasana, we come to what is known as ichcha. Ichcha means desire. So it's a preliminary desire which arises in our mind to continue performing that same activity, that same kriya. If we keep fulfilling that desire, that ichcha, it leads to a very intensified form of desire known as trishna. Trishna means an intense hankering, an intense thirst to perform that activity again. So this is the cycle that we're stuck in. Activity leads to anubhav, anubhav leads to samskar, a group of samskars, a family of samskars lead to a vasana, which leads to desire or ichcha, which leads to an intensified desire known as trishna, which then forces us to perform that activity again. And again, that activity can be a sinful activity. If we're devotees, we're practicing devotional service, then these samskars and these vasanas can be spiritual vasanas, which is exactly what we want to train our mind to do. Now Krishna says, I think it's in the 8th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, he says, Yam yam vapi smaram bhavam tyajanti ante kalevaram tam tam evaiti kaunteya sadatad bhavita. He says, whatever bhava you have at the time of death, your soul will attain to that body. Now it is said that these collection of samskaras and vasanas that we have in our consciousness, they form what is known as our svabhava. Svabhava. That means our bhava, our condition of consciousness. Sva means self. So it's our own self's state of consciousness, bhava. So that state of consciousness determines where we actually go, where the soul actually goes in its next life. So therefore it's very important that we as devotees, for ourselves and to teach others as well, we develop positive samskars and we develop positive vasanas. And that will help us so that we don't, as here Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was saying, that you're sitting in a solitary place and instead day and night you're thinking about enjoying with the opposite sex and accumulating more wealth. So we don't fall into that pitfall actually. So we go on to verse 3 now. Tomara kanaka bhogera janaka kanakera dvare sevaha madhava kami nira kama nahe tava dama tahara malika kevala yadava. Translation: my dear mind, you are attached to wealth, and due to Maya's influence, you want to use your money simply for the gratification of your material senses. But by this you will get no eternal satisfaction. You should use the wealth at your disposal in the service of the lotus feet of Lord Madhava, Krishna. Only then can you experience transcendental bliss from wealth. Your lusty desires to enjoy beautiful women are not an abode where you can find real shelter. The supreme lover is Yadava, Krishna. He is the supreme enjoyer and owner of everyone's love. Offer all your love and devotion to Lord Krishna, and you will be completely satisfied. I'll read briefly the purport by Jayapataka Maharaj. He's saying here, because this verse is focusing on wealth. So sometimes an overaccumulation of wealth can drive us away from devotional service. We learn in the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam when Kali Purush, he seeks shelter at the lotus feet of Parikshit Maharaj. Parikshit Maharaj says, you can live in the 4 places of sinful life. Places where there's gambling, prostitution, people are drinking, and animal slaughter. These 4 places you can live. But he also says, I'll give you an additional residence where there is money which is being accumulated. And Srila Prabhupada says that money leads to sense gratification and it leads to so many other sinful things. Wealth, if it is squandered and used by materialistic people, it leads to sinful life. So wealth is a big distraction for a practitioner, unless he or she uses it for Krishna's service. using the principle of Yukta Vairagya. But I'll just read what Maharaj is saying. He's saying, His Divine Grace Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is imparting appropriate instructions to the mind. The mind requires satisfying instructions which are given here. This wealth, O mind, to which you are so attached, does not belong to you. You have no right to enjoy it because it is not your property. There is only one rightful enjoyer of all your treasured possessions, and that is Lord Madhava, Sri Krishna, the husband of the goddess of fortune. If you really want to be happy, engage your wealth in the service of Lord Sri Krishna, Lord Madhava. Madhava is a name of Krishna describing him as the killer of the Madhu demon. In other words, Krishna removes obstacles from the path of the devotee. So Maharaj is saying we need to utilize our wealth in Krishna's service, and he gives a nice example of what happens if we don't. It's the example of the spider web. So he's saying that when a living being attempts to enjoy separately from the Lord, he enters Maya's web. So you can just imagine Maya. She's like this big spider, and she has this big spider web. And he says, Maharaj says, just as an unsuspecting insect flies into a spider's web and by struggling becomes increasingly entangled, so the equally unwitting living being becomes increasingly implicated in illusion. The more he struggles to implement his independent plans. So if we don't use our wealth in Krishna's service, or anything that we have in Krishna's service, and we try to seek happiness by trying to utilize it for ourselves, we're just like that fly who's struggling in the spider web to get free and be happy, but we get more implicated. Instead, on the other hand, like a baby spider can crawl nonchalantly across the web. The devotee who is linked with Lord Madhava, the original author of illusion, remains free from material entanglement. You're just like a baby spider in a carefree fashion. The baby spider walks across the web and is not caught in the web. So there's a nice story, you probably know of Tukaram, right? Saint Tukaram. It is said that Saint Tukaram, he inaugurated the Sankirtan movement in Maharashtra, in western central India. And it is also said, I think Srila Prabhupada mentions that he was initiated by Lord Chaitanya as well into the Sankirtan movement. So there's a nice story of Tukaram which sort of shows us the attitude of a devotee towards wealth. He used to live in a small town in Maharashtra called Dehu. And one day what happened is he came home and then he saw that his wife, I think her name is Jijabai, so she had started doing Lakshmi Puja. And he asked his wife, so, what are you doing? And she said, an astrologer told me that if I want to become wealthy, then I should do Lakshmi Puja. So he saw Jijabai, his wife, doing Lakshmi Puja for his home deities, which are Vitthal, who is Dwarkadish Krishna, and Vittal's consort is Rukmini, Queen Rukmini. So she was offering Lakshmi Puja to Queen Rukmini. And he said, you don't have to worship Rukmini Devi for wealth, the goddess of fortune, for wealth. Just engage all of your energy in worshipping Lord Vitthal. He will provide us with everything. In fact, this sort of worship, he told his wife, is actually known as Karma Mishra Bhakti, worshipping God for some material benediction. And it's actually not the best form of devotion. It doesn't please the Lord so much. And she said, look, you can worship your Lord Vitthal, and I'll worship Vittal's consort. What is the difficulty? What is the problem? You can worship Vitthal, I'll worship Vittal's consort. So in this way, she didn't listen to Tukaram. So some weeks later, Tukaram, he came home during the daytime for lunch, and he saw that his wife and his children were wearing very expensive, very luxurious, and really opulent clothing. And his house was decorated with jewels and so many different ornaments. And he asked his wife, so, what has happened? How come there's such a big transformation? It's similar to the story we read in the 10th canto of Bhagavatam of Sudama. He coming home from Dwarka after visiting Krishna, and he sees his home is transformed into this gigantic palace. So maybe not to that extent, but still, he saw that his wife and his children and his home was fully decorated. So he asked, how has this change come about? And she said, Queen Rukmini, she answered, Lord Vitthal, he answered my prayers of getting wealth for myself. And this very much dissatisfied and displeased Tukaram. So much so that he actually left his house. He didn't take his lunch there. He just left. And often Tukaram would leave his house and not come back for some days. He would be absorbed in his bhajan. So his wife thought, yeah, maybe he's gone. So, a few days passed, 3-4 days passed, and Tukaram didn't come back. Then, 2 weeks passed, and Tukaram still didn't come back. Then 1 entire month passed, and Tukaram still didn't come back. And by this time, his wife was feeling very guilty and feeling very afraid as to what happened to her husband. So she decided to leave the town of Dehu, the village of Dehu, and travel about 300 kilometers away to Pandharpur, because she thought that Tukaram would be in Pandharpur. And we know many of our ISKCON devotees, especially on Maharashtra, they actually go on Padayatra to the Pandharpur temple, the Lord Vithal's temple there. So she went there, and she asked the Brahmanas and the sadhus who had gathered there as to, Tukaram's whereabouts. And they said, we haven't seen him. So that night, as she was taking rest around the temple of Lord Vithal came to her in a dream, and he said, look, Tukaram, he's still in the village of Dehu. He hasn't left. And he told her the exact location where he was. He was on top of some mountain or something like that. So the very next morning, she went back to her village. She went to the exact place, and there she saw Tukaram, her husband, sitting, absorbed in singing and glorifying Lord Vithal. And she found out that he hadn't eaten anything for 1 entire month. And he had like a big beard because he didn't take care of his body for that entire month. He was but even though he was emaciated and physically weak, still with full energy and full volume, he was glorifying Lord Vithal, Dwarkadish Krishna. And his wife said, please come home. And he said, there's no need for me to come home. Now you've started Lakshmi Puja. So now because you're a performer of Lakshmi Puja, you're very capable of taking care of the family. I don't need to be there. So his wife at that point in time, seeing the humility and the faith of Tukaram in Lord Vithal, she was like, she got like this realization from the Paramatma in her heart. And she sort of broke down and she cried and she says, okay, I'll give this up. More important to me than getting wealth and all these different material facilities for myself is to have my husband, who is a pure devotee of the Lord, to have him with me to instruct me and guide me in devotional service. So in this way, Tukaram came back. So we see here as a devotee does have wealth, and devotees use wealth in Krishna's service. At the same time, we see here in this example of Tukaram that a devotee is not attached to the wealth at all. In a fraction of a second, as Tukaram did, the devotee can renounce everything. He or she can utilize the wealth in Krishna service, but the devotee is not attached to the wealth. Okay, so that's verse 3. Go on to verse 4. Pratishtasha taru jad maya maru na pela ravana yujiya raghava Vaisnava pratishta tate kara nishtha taha na bajile labhi be raurava. Translation: my dear mind, beware of your desire to attain material reputation. It is misleading you with its attractive vision, like an oasis of green trees, but is simply a mirage in the desert of this world of repeated birth and death. It will cause you utter spiritual destruction. Remember how Ravana, the powerful demon, was bewildered due to false pride, and in spite of all his efforts to achieve temporary material prominence, he was destroyed by Raghava, Lord Ramachandra. The only position you should desire is to become a true Vaishnava, a pure devotee of the Lord. Give all your care and attention for obtaining this. If instead you neglect to purely worship the Supreme Personality of Godhead due to your offenses, for all your hard endeavors, your life will simply be hellish. I'll read a nice paragraph which Jayapataka Maharaj is telling us, instructing us, all the devotees. He's saying, in his purports, Srila Prabhupada uses the appropriate analogy of cream. Cream naturally rises to the top of milk. Similarly, if a devotee's desires are pure, light, and free from all material contaminations, those pure desires will pull one higher and higher in devotional activities. There is no need to be misled. This is an important point. Maharaj is saying there is no need to be misled one should exclude all other desires except for one. And what is that? To be the servant of the servant. In other words, to be a pure Vaishnava. For a devotee, even mukti, liberation, is not important. Mukti is already achieved if a devotee is pure. Pure devotee means, as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu indicates, a devotee with no extraneous desires. Na dhanam, na janam, na sundarim, kavitam va jagati shikame, mama janmani janmanishvare, bhavatad bhaktir ahoitukitavai. So Maharaj is telling us that we should get rid of all desires and just have one desire, to become the servant of the servant of the servant. Gopi Bhartur Padakamalyor Das Das Anudasa, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says, I simply identify myself as being the servant of the servant of the servant of Krishna, who is the maintainer of the gopis. One of the big things in our Vaishnava Siddhanta is Vaishnava Seva. And this very much pleases the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And because he says that, he tells Arjuna that if you consider yourself to be my devotee in the Adi Puran, you're actually not my devotee. But one who considers them to be a devotee of my devotee, he's actually my devotee. Now in this translation to this verse, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is actually saying that for those who are practicing bhakti or Krishna consciousness with some ulterior motive, other than wanting to become a servant of the Vaishnavas, he's saying that material reputation, fame, position, prestige, they start to look very attractive like an oasis of green trees. And in this regard, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur gives us an very apt story, instructive story in his Upakyani Upadesh. And it's a story of Balam rice and cow ghee. You might have heard of this story. Of a wealthy landowner. And this wealthy landowner, he used to hire so many servants. One after one, he would hire a servant. And he would give them very easy tasks to perform. But after some time, the servant would just leave. He would say, no, this work you're giving me is too difficult, it's too hard, I'm leaving, I'm out of here. So he had a very intelligent friend. And he put this question to his friend, look, my servants are just leaving, I need someone dedicated to perform work for me. To maintain my house, etc. And then his servant said, I'll tell you, I'll give you a plan. What you do is the servant that you have currently, you feed him a very nice quantity of freshly cooked balam rice. Now balam rice is actually a type of basmati rice which grows in a particular section of Bangladesh. There's a village in Bangladesh called, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it's called Barishal or Barisal. And it's apparently the capital of the rice industry. So they produce a lot of rice in that particular town. So one of the, you can say, the delicacies in that town is a type of basmati rice called balam rice. So his friend advises the landlord, every day feed your servant a very nice quantity of freshly cooked, hot, steaming balam rice. And in that balam rice, mix a big quantity of nice cow ghee. And just keep doing this for 6 months. And meanwhile, just give him some little service here and there. So he does that. And after 6 months, as his friend advised him, he starts to tell his servant, okay, now start doing this work, now start doing that work. He starts to increase his workload. And then, as usual, the servant starts to complain, oh, you're giving me too much work, I'm out of here, I'm going to go work for someone else. So he walks out, and he looks for a job, and he gets some easy job somewhere else, at someone else's house. And as he's performing the work in someone else's house, then what happens? He remembers the cow ghee and the balam rice, and his attachment has grown over the last 6 months from taking this high quality food. So even though the work is very easy there in his new job, he says, I have to go back to my old master because he was feeding me this nice food. So he comes back. And then he goes again to get another job. And he says, no, I have to come back. So he gets attached to this. And then what happens? And he stays there. He continues, working. for the landlord. And then sometimes it's explained in the story that after some time the wealthy landlord, he meets his friend in some marketplace, and they meet each other, and the landlord exclaims to his friend, "All glories to Balam rice and cow ghee." So the moral of the story is that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is explaining that sometimes we who are performing devotional service, we also say, even though it may be very easy, we say, "No, I don't want to do this. It's too hard. It's too hard to, maybe wake up in the morning. It's too hard to chant. It's too hard to follow the 4 regulated principles. Too hard to just give up all these things, material music, food, and just take prasad. It's too difficult to do all these things." But Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur says that sometimes the expert guide or the spiritual master may have to tempt the neophyte devotee by giving them positions like head of department or head of such and such, or some big managerial positions. And once we get these, then we'll continue very happily with the austerity of performing devotional service. So that position or that recognition within the Vaishnava circle is said to be that balam rice and the cow ghee. We get attached to these things. So therefore, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is explaining that we should not practice devotional service and undergo the austerities of devotional service seeking material reputation. Otherwise, we'll come to a stage where we practice devotional service only to get recognition. I'll only practice devotional service if I'm recognized, if I have some high post, if I'm recognized by other devotees. So that's another pitfall. We're going to verse 5. Harijana dvesha pratishdasha klesha karakena tabe tahara gaurava Vaishnavera pache pratishdasha ache tate kabu nahe anitya vaibhava. So this is a nice one. My dear mind, what kind of Vaishnava are you? In the name of solitary worship, you are simply engaged in criticizing and committing offenses against the Vaishnavas. You have become envious towards the pure devotees of Lord Krishna. Instead of tasting the nectar of being a real Vaishnava, you are simply suffering due to your desire to gain flickering material prestige and position. Then in spite of your fallen condition, why do you remain so proud of your solitary worship? Now you should try to become a real Vaishnava. To become a pure devotee of Krishna is actually the most glorious position anyone can achieve. If you really desire to achieve perfection, then give up this practice of solitary worship, and in the association of devotees, practice pure unmotivated devotional service. In the sincere practice of pure devotional service, there is no influence of Maya. So this verse, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is focusing on the neophyte devotee, criticizing the Vaishnavas. So sometimes we hold grudges and we criticize devotees. This is another pitfall that we have to be on the lookout when we're practicing bhakti. Now this hati mata offense, the Vaishnava aparad offense, is the most treacherous, heavy offense. And we see in the pastime of Ambarish Maharaj and Durvasa Muni that even Krishna, if we commit Vaishnava aparad, even Krishna will not forgive us. It is only if we have the humility to go and fall at the Vaishnava's feet, and if the Vaishnava forgives us, and the Vaishnava being compassionate will forgive us. If the Vaishnava forgives us, then Krishna will forgive us. There is no other way out of this Vaishnava aparad. And we see the story of Jagai and Madai. So we know that they're big debauchees and all these sort of things. And it is said that actually they were performing sinful activities. They weren't performing Vaishnava aparad. They weren't offending Vaishnavas. But still Vaishnavas were upset with their activities. They felt sorry for them. So finally Madai was the one who actually threw the clay pot at Lord Nityananda, which started to bleed. We know the story. Haridas Thakur, he runs back, gets Lord Chaitanya, comes, and he comes with his Sudarshan Chakra. And Nityananda Prabhu begs Lord Chaitanya, please don't kill these two brothers. You have come here to kill the sinful tendency within the conditioned souls, not to kill the conditioned souls themselves. the body of the conditioned soul, in this particular avatar incarnation. And in this way, they actually become great devotees by the mercy of Lord Nityananda. Now, it is said, Jayapataka Maharaj mentions elsewhere, he mentions that, so one day, Madai, feeling very upset with himself for performing so much sinful activities, he approaches Lord Nityananda in a solitary place. And he reveals his mind to Lord Nityananda. He says, I performed so much sinful activity. How can I repay the Vaishnavas and people at large for all the things I've committed? I can't even go to them one by one and apologize, because so many people have been offended by my sins, my mischievous behavior. Lord Nityananda tells him, I'll give you a way out of this. He says, see that particular bathing place near the Ganges there? Every day go there and clean that ghat, it's called, the bathing place. And maintain that place very nicely. And as the Vaishnavas and as the Brahmanas and all the other rest of people, they come to take their bath at that particular place in the Ganges, they'll see that you have maintained this place very nicely, it's very clean, and in this way they'll give you their blessings. So this place still exists today, it's called Madai Ghat. And it's explained that the Vaishnavas in that part of Navadvip, I guess, they always used to see Madai at that bathing ghat, and he would always be carrying a shovel in one hand, and with the other hand he would be chanting japa. And while people would come, he would prostrate before them and pay his obeisances, and tears would be coming out of his eyes, and he would apologize to every single person that would come there. And every day he was cleaning the ghat, removing the rubbish from there. And in this way he got the mercy, not of just the Vaishnavas, but of the people. Because Jiva Aparad is another type of aparad. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur explains that one should not criticize just the Vaishnavas, one should not criticize people in general. Because time is separating them from becoming Vaishnavas in the future. Right? So I'll just mention something that Jiva Goswami is saying, something practical for us to apply. So Jiva Goswami explains in the Bhakti Sandarbha, he gives a breakdown of 6 different types of Vaishnava aparads that we need to be on the lookout of. One commits a Vaishnava aparad if, number 1, he happens to kill or murder another Vaishnava. So definitely we should not do something like that. But Jiva Goswami explains that if one kills a Vaishnava, that is a very significant Vaishnava aparad. Number 2, if we blaspheme another Vaishnava, that is another subcategory of Vaishnava aparad that we should avoid. We should not blaspheme. Read the 10 offenses to the holy name. The first one is to blaspheme the devotees who have dedicated their lives to preaching the glories of the holy name. Number 3, if we hold grudges or if we hate other devotees within our heart, then although we may not verbally say anything to them, but in our mind we're still holding a grudge against another devotee, that is still considered to be a Vaishnava aparad. Number 4, if a Vaishnava or Vaishnavi happens to visit your house, or let's say the temple, in our situation, and we don't welcome them properly, we don't give them a proper reception, some water to drink, or according to our position, then if we don't welcome a Vaishnava properly, that is also another type of Vaishnava aparad. Number 5, if we become angry at a Vaishnava, so if we show our anger towards a Vaishnava, then that is another type of Vaishnava aparad. And number 6, which is something we should really be on the lookout of, is not smiling or greeting a Vaishnava. So if 2 Vaishnavas are walking, the other way, past each other, and if you don't greet the other Vaishnava saying, Hare Krishna Prabhu, or Hare Krishna Mataji, or if you don't give eye contact, or if you don't smile at the other Vaishnava, at least, like Radheshyam Prabhu says, that even if one doesn't get along with another devotee, one should at least maintain a Hari Bol relationship with them. At least you should be able to say Hari Bol to the other Vaishnava. So this is the 6th type of Vaishnava aparad which Jiva Goswami explains. Not smiling or recognizing the presence of another Vaishnava. So something to look out for, these different types of Vaishnava aparads. And we come to the last text for today, text number 6. Se hari sambandha, shunya maya gandha, taha kabu naya jadera kaitava. Pratishta chandali, nirjanata jali, ubhaye janiha maika rourava. Translation is, my dear mind, why are you so proud of being a pure devotee of Krishna? A pure devotee of the Lord performs favorable devotional service in his constitutional relationship as an eternal servitor of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna. A pure devotee's desire to serve Lord Krishna is completely pure and without the influence of even a trace of material motives. Your practice of solitary worship is simply cheating. Again, he keeps on that theme of solitary worship. But actual pure devotional service is ever free from material duplicity and hypocrisy, stemming from the material cheating propensity. My dear mind, beware of both the Pratishta Chandali, the treacherous witch who enchants and bewilders devotees with the desire for cheap popularity, as well as, here's the Sanskrit or Bengali version of solitary bhajan, Nirjanata Jali, which translates to the deadly net of solitary worship, which traps devotees in Maya's illusion when they leave the association of devotees to perform solitary devotional service. Note that both are different aspects of the most hellish material existence known as Raurava. So here Maharaj is quoting from Chaitanya Charitamrita about these two different things, Pratishta Chandali, the bewilderment of the devotees to perform devotional service for cheap popularity, and the tendency for us to go off by ourselves and practice devotional service. These are weeds growing along with our creeper of devotion. Some unnecessary creepers growing with the bhakti creeper are the creepers of behavior unacceptable for those trying to attain perfection. Diplomatic behavior, animal killing, mundane profiteering, mundane adoration, mundane importance. All these are unwanted creepers. Nishiddachar, Kutinatha, Jiva Himsa, Labha Puja and Pratishtadi. So he quotes again from Madhya Lila, chapter 19. If one does not distinguish between the Bhakti Lata creeper and the other creepers, the sprinkling of water is misused because the other creepers are nourished while the Bhakta Lata creeper is curtailed. As soon as an intelligent devotee sees an unwanted creeper, now again, sometimes we can't tell the difference between a weed and the actual Bhakti Lata. So we need the help of devotees to point that out to us. If we're practicing devotional service by ourselves, like Bharat Maharaj, no one was there present to tell him that he was getting too attached to the deer. So even though we're in the stage of bhava, the lack of association of devotees or Vaisnava Ninda, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur explains that it reduces the level of progress we've made in bhakti. If we're on the stage of bhava, let's say, and we happen to offend a devotee, we commit Vaishnava aparad, we lose the quality of bhava that we're on, and our bhakti degrades to that extent. He explains like this. When the fruit, here we go. Yeah. As soon as an intelligent devotee sees an unwanted creeper growing beside the original creeper, he must cut it down instantly. Then the real creeper of Bhakti Lata grows nicely, returns home back to God and seeks shelter on the under the lotus feet of Krishna. So I'll just finish with one story regarding Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. Because sometimes, like, we're on the theme of criticizing other Vaishnavas like that. So there's another nice instructive story where once some disciples of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, they approached him and they asked him, so, dear Guru Maharaj, how can we serve you? And he said, go to Bengal and start a temple there. Open up a temple, a preaching center there. And once it is open, I'll come there with many other devotees and we'll make it a really big thing. We'll have a really big program there. So I think it was a group of brahmacharis. They actually left and they actually traveled to Bengal. And for many, many weeks, months, they worked really hard to establish this new preaching center, this new temple. And then they very excitedly invited Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, their Guru Maharaj, to come. And Maharaj came and he saw very successful preaching program. Deities were very nice, very immaculate worship was going on. But then Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur asked these group of brahmacharis, along with you there was one more brahmachari which had come initially to help you set up this temple. Where is he? And this group of devotees, this group of brahmacharis, they told their Guru Maharaj, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, they said, oh, unfortunately, Guru Maharaj, due to circumstances, what happened is that he sort of left our association. We didn't leave our association. What actually happened is that he fell into a relationship with a Mataji. And when we found out that he was doing like this, we severely chastised him. And we rebuked his behavior very heavily. And as a result of that chastisement, he was very embarrassed and he ran away. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur says, that's it, I've had enough. I can't leave this preaching temple, this preaching center, this temple open anymore. Bring this devotee back. If you don't bring this devotee back, I will never set my foot again into this preaching center. And these group of brahmacharis are very scared, very afraid. So they have traveled everywhere in the local district trying to look for this brahmachari. Finally, after a long, long time, they found him. And they apologized, saying, dear Prabhu, very sorry. We chastise you so severely. Srila Prabhupada, who is also known as Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he is calling you back to please come. Because what had happened is, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur had told this group of brahmacharis, do you know how much gallons of sweat and blood that devotees have to spend just to take one jiva out of Maya and engage them in Krishna's service? Do you know how much effort it takes? Like Prabhupada said, I had to walk through fire to set up the Krishna consciousness movement. And here you are in a position where you're not supposed to chastise and correct, but you chastise this person, and as a result, this person has run away from Krishna consciousness, which is the greatest loss. The greatest loss is once having come to Krishna consciousness to run away. So when these brahmacharis, they found him, finally, they told him, Prabhupada, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is calling you back. This brahmachari, he started to cry and he said, I found a job in a watch company. Apparently he was making or fixing some watches. And he said, in my mind I was always thinking that I want to come back. But I was too embarrassed. What would Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur say? What would the rest of the devotees say? So because I was too embarrassed, I didn't come back. But now that you have told me that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur himself is requesting and begging me to come back, tears started to gush from his eyes. He started to cry so much. And he said, my Guru Maharaj, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, is so merciful, so compassionate. In fact, he's even more merciful than Krishna. And in this way, this particular brahmachari, he gave up whatever job he had, and he ran back to that particular temple, and he fell down prostrated at the lotus feet of his Guru Maharaj. And it's explained that as soon as he did that, all these anarthas which he had developed from that illicit relationship, they all got washed away. So even though a new devotee or an uncontrolled devotee or even an experienced devotee who accidentally happens to fall down, as Krishna says, that if a devotee happens to fall down, if the devotee is sincere and still is engaging in devotional service, he is still to be considered saintly. He is still to be considered a sadhu. He is not to be rebuked and chastised by the Vaisnavas so that he leaves their association, because it takes so much effort just to make one devotee. So this is the point which Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was explaining. So that brings us to the conclusion of the first six verses. So we'll continue with this. It's very insightful and very practical book for guidance. And Jayapataka Maharaj makes the point that devotees should very regularly read this particular poem by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, so that we can instruct our mind and we can purify our intelligence, so that we can stay firmly fixed on the path of pure devotion to Krishna. Okay, so we'll continue next Wednesday for the rest of the verses. Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Goswami Maharaj ki jai, Jai Nitai Gaur Premanande.